Hello, I'm Finola from RaaS, and today our focus is on Empire Energy Group, ASX ticker EEG, and joining us is Managing Director Alex Underwood, and also joining us is my colleague, Andrew Williams. Thank you both for joining us.
Good morning, Finola.
Good morning. Andy, I'm going to pass to you to ask all the technical questions and see how we go from there.
Yeah, good morning, Alex. The testing results you provided earlier this week look really, really strongly encouraging, if not, outstanding in their own way. I think the thing that stood out for me there was the progress you've made, particularly on the Carpentaria 2H well, where you do have increased productivity, so you're producing more on a lower decline rate. I was wondering if we could just start telling us how you've actually achieved that before we go into what the implications of that may be.
Yeah, certainly, Andy. So what we've done on Carpentaria 2H is we have reopened that well after a 5-month period of shut-in to test what we call soaking in the industry. And essentially what soaking involves is looking to reduce the amount of water remaining in the wellbore and the fracture formation due to a process called imbibition. And so essentially it's residual water imbibing out into the reservoir. This has been a proven methodology in some, but not all US shale plays. One area that it's been highly successful with dramatic improvements in productivity in some areas has been the Marcellus shale as an example. And so if we look through what we've done on this well since we started last year, we drilled and fracked the well. It had a 1.25 kilometre horizontal section. We did a 21-stage frack across 927 metres of that well. We pumped about 6 million pounds of sand, which is the proppant that holds open the fractures. And when you pump in that sand, you're pumping in very large volumes of water that carry the sand into the fractures. Then in any shale play, you expect to recover a proportion of that water, typically around 30 to 40%, depending on the basin you're in. And when we carried out our initial 51 days of flow testing on Carpentaria 2H, we recovered a significant proportion of the water, somewhere in the low 30s%, but we were still getting quite a bit of water along with the gas stream. So we shut it in for 5 months. During that time, we drilled another well, Carpentaria 3H, and while the well was shut in, essentially what we've found now is that the water indeed has imbibed, not all of it, but a great proportion of it, and that has a couple of beneficial effects on the way that the well produces going forward. If you think down to the level of the fractures in the gas-bearing formation, those fractures contain water, and the gas needs to move past that water in order to enter the wellbore and reach the surface. So what we've been able to do with this imbibition and soaking process essentially is move those water molecules away from the fracture face, and that removes the blockages to gas production, as a result of which we've seen a quite material impact on production rate. So over the first 8 days of the new flow testing period compared to the first 8 days of the prior flow testing period, on average, it's about 21% higher, but also we're seeing a much lower rate of decline. And the rate on day 8 versus the original day 8 rate was about 33% higher. So, this is a very material improvement and encourages us significantly in terms of the way that we will look to economically produce these wells, maximise returns, but also how we look to complete them and flow test them going forward.
I understand you'll continue to flow test the 2H well, looking to establish a 30-day type curve. Can you provide some context on what that 30-day type curve is going to give you at the end and how that sort of fits in with your thoughts on early production opportunities and going through the feed process?
Yeah, sure. So under our environmental approvals from the NT government, we are allowed up to 90 days to flow test this well. We used 51 of those days in the initial period, so now we have 39 days that we can continue flow testing. We're in about day 10 now. Our announcement was a couple of days ago. So we've got about another 30 days to go. What we want to do is now generate an updated and upgraded 30-day IP curve. We put out a 30-day IP on this well last year. We will put out a new 30-day IP on which we expect to have a higher average rate. What that then allows us to do is work with our reservoir engineering consultants to develop a prediction of what a well of this nature is likely to produce over the life of the well, so over the 20 to 30-year life of the well. 30 days is a relatively short period in the scheme of things. And so one thing we're considering internally is if we seek government approvals to extend that period and get more data. But essentially, once we have that updated 30-day IP curve, it gives us some important information that can feed into the planning process to move into pilot production. So once we understand what we think a very conservative estimate is of what a type well, as we call it, a theoretical new well will produce, we can then extrapolate out. So we can say, well, if it produced this much gas over 927 metres of horizontal section, then if we drill the same rock and we carry out the same frac strategies, and ultimately we actually expect to optimise and get better rates than that. But as a baseline, if we can then say, okay, well, if we drill a 3 kilometre lateral, if we were getting 3 million cubic feet a day on 1 kilometre, we're likely to get 9 million cubic feet a day on 3 kilometres. And then we can start really running our economics in earnest. But it also has some very important follow-on effects. So, we've been discussing with some parties around gas sales agreements. Well, now we actually have some real data that we can lean on to demonstrate that we can deliver that gas. We can really move into our gas pipeline transportation negotiations in earnest, and those are ongoing. And then also we can start to pull together our really firm design of what surface facilities will look like for that pilot project so that we can approach our board in the coming months to seek a final investment decision on moving into that pilot project and really focusing on getting into production. And, one of the real benefits for a small company like ours in a very capital intensive industry of moving into pilot production and selling the gas as we go up this learning curve is that we're actually recycling that capital. So rather than, going out and issuing shares to investors every time we want to drill a well, we'll actually be able to generate revenue from that production and start to generate returns for our shareholders as we continue getting up the technical learning curve.
I think the very important sentence there is, generating your own cash flow to move forward. I think everyone in the small gas space would love to be in that position, or certainly in that position, sort of from a pre-development perspective. It strikes me that you've only drilled 4 wells in Carpentaria. You're still trialling different frac methods, so in no sense really can any of these wells be considered to be what will be your optimal final design. So would it be accurate or would it be overstretching to say that the 2H 30-day IP 30-day type curve is probably going to be a bit conservative, and how that sort of impacts into your economic thinking from there?
Yeah, I certainly expect so. I mean, if you go back to, say, the late 2000s era when shale gas was really kicking off in America, I remember that period vividly as, we were investing in that space when I was at Macquarie Bank. The first shale gas wells in America that were drilled, had a tiny fraction of the productivity that they do today. So, the Barnett Shale in Texas around the Dallas-Fort Worth area was one of the areas where they really started getting going on shale gas development. And I remember the story of the well, I believe it was SW Griffin number 4, if I'm not mistaken, that was drilled in the Barnett Shale. That really was what that company referred to as the aha moment, where they realised that shale drilling was going to work. That was a well that came on at 1.2 million cubic feet a day, And yet it was really at the trigger point of an incredible boom in the US shale space, where now 70% of natural gas comes from shales. The Marcellus Formation is arguably the largest gas field on Earth. It's given the US energy independence. They're now, exporting a lot of gas. And also, I was just reading a Wood Mackenzie report indicating that there are $100 billion US dollars worth of LNG export terminals planned between now and 2027 in the US. All of that is fed by shale gas, and those wells now produce at 20 million cubic feet a day plus in the best areas. So, they started at 1.2 where they worked out it was going to work. Now they're at 20 times that. I'm certainly not forecasting that we'll be getting 20 times the productivity that we're seeing right now. But I would say, if you look at the Beetaloo Basin, which has been described by Andrew Liveris as the third largest shale gas accumulation on Earth, this is an enormous basin with enormous volumes of gas in it. But the actual number of wells drilled to date is very low. There's been 4 wells in our Carpentaria area, 2 of which were verticals, 2 of which were horizontals. There's only been 5 vertical wells drilled on our other properties acquired from Pangaea Resources, and then really a handful of horizontal wells drilled in between our property sets by other companies. So, we really are at the cusp of an enormous learning curve here as an industry. And to be getting rates that we're seeing now of, 3 million cubic feet a day on a 927 metre horizontal, I think it is a very conservative rate in terms of what we would look to achieve going forward. I note in particular that if you look at some of our historical announcements around this well, we are very much in the R&D phase. So we've trialled 4 different types of frac fluids. We're trialling different perforation strategies. We're still working out how tightly to space each frac stage, how many clusters to put in each stage. Given where we're at the infancy of the Beetaloo, I think there is ample opportunity for significant productivity increases. But, in terms of our economic planning, we do have to, make sure that we are, very careful stewards of our shareholders' capital. And so, we want to make sure that this project's going to work economically on very conservative assumptions, and then enjoy the upside from there.
And just one last thing from me. You've got even a limited amount. You've got some more test data from the 3H well, and you've completed at least the vertical component of Carpentaria 4, which again looks to be very positive in terms of the data to hand. And I understand Netherland Sewell are undertaking a revised resource assessment. Do you have any sort of broad expectations, given more data and more positive data, to where that might be able to lead you?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of Carpentaria 4V, it's really that well that is the basis for what we anticipate to be a quite material resource upgrade. The reason for that is that, first of all, as a company, it's our view that there is gas present right across the Carpentaria East and Carpentaria South locations within EP 187. Our confidence around that is driven by the fact that these shales are incredibly consistent and gas charged right across the basin. It's not like there's any major fault blocks that are separating out these areas or anything like that. However, certified petroleum engineers are required to follow the rules of the Petroleum Resource Management System prescribed by the Society of Petroleum Engineers. And so what we lacked until recently with the drilling of Carpentaria 4V was sufficient well control to demonstrate that we indeed have discovered resource further to the east in that Carpentaria East area. So the Netherland Sewell assessment that was done at the beginning of last year booked 396 BCF of 2C resource simply by taking the well control of the Carpentaria 1 well pad and the Carpentaria 2/3 well pad and saying, well, there's discovered gas between those two well pads, so now we can start to delineate notional drilling blocks, which were 1 square kilometre drilling blocks, and a number of blocks were essentially delineated on the map between those two locations in a roughly north-south orientation, but with a bit of an elliptical shape as you move between the two. Now we've drilled a well much further out to the east, and that well not only shows very, very strong consistency of all 4 of the shales, the A, intra-A, B, and C shales, but also we can see that these shales are deeper, about 150 metres deeper than at the Carpentaria 2-3 location. But also the B shale, which is our core target for the time being, is about 20% thicker in net pay terms. So what is going on now is essentially a bunch of analysis to look at the log data. We have core analysis going on in Houston, and all of that will be pulled together to generate an upgraded resource assessment. It would be remiss of me to predict what the numerical impact of that is because, first of all, we don't know the number yet, but also, I don't want to be seen to be jawboning our independent resource assessors. But it's our internal view that we should see a very material increase now that we have essentially triangulated between 3 locations to see very, very high consistency of gas-bearing shales.
Alex, can you remind us?
Sorry.
Just going to say, Alex, can you just remind us of the timing of the next steps for exploration and the resource update?
Yeah, certainly. So we have a very busy period ahead of us. We have very few periods in our company that aren't busy, and we've got a very hard-working and loyal team for whom I'm very appreciative. But in the near term, we have a lot going on. So we expect the Netherlands Sul report in the coming weeks. Also, on the administrative side, we expect to receive the final grant payment under the Beetaloo Cooperative Drilling Program in the coming weeks. That's another $7.6 million cash coming in, which reimburses 25% of the cost of activities we carried out last year in accordance with the terms of that program. We have a new upgraded 30-day IP curve coming in about the next 3 weeks or so. There's a lot of analysis going on between our technical and operations teams and also the expert consultants in North America to start to look at some of these type curve extrapolations over the life of a well, starting to pull together economic analysis. And then also in parallel with all that, a lot of work on the commercial side, as I mentioned. So, negotiating our maiden gas sales agreement, negotiating a pipeline access agreement and starting to put the pieces together in terms of that. And then also we have another stream of work going on in relation to the regulatory approvals. So, we're very pleased to see that the Northern Territory government has put the final piece of enabling legislation in place to allow a movement into either the award of production licenses or what's referred to as beneficial use of test gas, which essentially is allowing sale of test gas to facilitate further appraisal work. There'll be a lot of work in terms of Indigenous consent, so going out to visit with our traditional owner friends to work through with them the terms on which production would be allowed. I note that we have a framework for that already in place, so this would look at formalising that framework and seeking regulatory approvals such that we can move towards a final investment decision and then start pulling together the pilot project.
Well, Alex, I'm looking forward to catching up with you again through the course of 2023, and with Andy Williams. Thank you both for joining us today, and looking forward to that further conversation.